Hey, it's Chad.
And we are the Marshals of Truth. Okay, so guys, we're starting off a new series, a new special series um, on ethno-nationalism because the last time that we released, we were talking about the connection between far left and far right, and as we did so, we talked a lot about fascism, the idea of fascism, and how like many fascist dictators, between the two that were uncontroversially fascist, being Mussolini and Hitler, that they interpreted in the same similar way that many that followed Le Bon and many that followed Sorel did in their interpretation of Marxism, that the nation is the race and the race is the nation. And so with that idea, we wanted to follow on not necessarily fascism, but that idea that the nation is the state, which is ethno-nationalism. So
Yeah,
to do that, we want to start off with defining nationalism.
yeah. So when we talked about fascist leaders, one of the ideas that we kind of brought up was the idea of fascism being nationalist socialism. And with that last series, we kind of focused on the parallels of the socialism parts, um, comparing how they use the crowds, things like that. But in this series, we're going to be focusing on the nationalism parts. And nationalism goes for more than just fascists. It could be for theocracies, for just straight up authoritarians. And it's an idea that, as we'll come to explain, is one that still continues today very prevalently, and is even rising in popularity. And so to start out, we'd like to get towards defining what exactly ethno-nationalism is, and to do so, we got to start out with the idea of nationalism. So, what is nationalism? You have something there?
Um, yeah, I just want to show a photo. Can you allow the screen share?
Oh, yes.
All right, yeah, keep going.
Yeah. And so we'd like to explain what is just plain nationalism. So, according to Merriam-Webster, nationalism is a sense of national consciousness exalting one nation above all others and placing primary emphasis on promotions of its culture and interests as opposed to those other nations or supranational groups. So, in essence, what nationalism is displaying the importance of one nation, one people, one country. Will define kind of what the nation is a little bit, but putting the interest of one of those groups above every other of those groups, of those states, countries, ethnicities in the entire world, saying that that is the most important. I think a very good slogan that you hear nowadays that kind of emphasizes a nationalist point is the slogan America First. And this was used by various US presidents, but very popular with Donald Trump and somewhat continued with Joe Biden. But the idea of America First being that the interest of the United States, the interest of the American people, are more important than the interest of Europe, of organizations like NATO or the European Union or China or Russia. But the idea that this country, that our people are more important than your people, your nation. And so that's what nationalism itself seeks to promote or seeks to do. Um, and one idea that comes with that is what the idea of the nation is. And when you think of a nation, it seems simple. It's, a group of people that live, within a state or something like that. But it's actually a question that has been pondered over by various different philosophers, anthropologists, political scientists, and one that still is in contention today. And we'll see how people try to bend the definition of a nation or seeking to malign it, that sort of stuff. But according to an article by the Penn State Department for Government, and we'll have this in the sources, of course, um, a nation is a group of people, so not like a state, it's the group of people who see themselves as a cohesive and coherent unit based on shared cultural or historical criteria. And these historical criteria usually are a shared culture, a shared language, a shared background, and sometimes even a shared religion. Um, so, according to this, a nation is that group of people who can kind of come together and say that they have similar things that they practice or a similar place that they live in. Um, and with that, we could kind of go towards the idea of what an ethnicity is, because it's very similar to what a nation is, and as we'll see, it comes up as the basis of why people would form nations. But we'll start to define ethnicity itself, and then also compare that to like race. Yeah.
Right. I have this photo right here to explain just how shaky of a foundation ethno-nationalism is. And in this photo here, it specifically only talks about nationalism, but it applies for the broader concept because you really are bringing a group of people blindly down the edge of a cliff, and it's just not a great way to go off into the future, because you have a group of people following blindly their leader, and they define what the identity is, which is inherently exclusive and not a great way to unite people. So, with ethnicity, um, as defined by dictionary.com, it's a social group that shares a common distinctive culture, religion, and language. And language, religion, and culture, they are key to defining an ethnicity. And we have certain examples of like big ethnic groups in the world that some of you guys may know about, like Eastern Europe, Eastern Europeans. They are typically called Slavs. Um, like Yugoslavia, that was a nation that was developed post World War I and lasted until the early 90s and the late 80s, early 90s. Of a group of South Slavic people in southeastern Europe that formed a nation. But they weren't the only group of Slavic peoples in Eastern Europe. There's also Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and much of Eastern Europe. They are classified, as many would say, as Slavs ethnically, um, with a somewhat similar language. This includes even Bulgaria. So, yeah, like Eastern Europe. And then with Arab, the Arab ethnic group that takes up most of the Middle East, but obviously goes a lot very broadly outward beyond it as well because of the early Muslim expansion in the 600s and 700s AD. That's why there are Arabs, like majority Arabs, in much of North Africa, like Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. Um, and they also spread, of course, like to Saudi Arabia, where much of the Arab people originated. Um,
Yeah.
and
And
then
with
Syria,
yeah,
yeah,
just to add on that, with the Arab people, that's a great example of where you have the shared characteristics of an ethnic group. Language, Arabic. The majority of Arab peoples or the people in that area speak Arabic, therefore common language. Another one that you get is a common religion. In those areas, it's most common to follow Islam, and so that is a religion that ties these group of people together. So you get that shared language, you get that shared religion, and then you get the shared culture as well, and that comes with just the Arab cultures that transcends countries. That's the difference between like an ethnic group and just like a state or just like a nation, is that it
right.
transcends the borders of Saudi Arabia or Syria or Lebanon or Libya. Like it's a group of people throughout all these lands, that share these cultures, these characteristics, and that countries would be formed out of these ethnic groups, but usually they're not confined to just one country. That's what makes it different between an ethnicity and just citizens of X country.
And that's why, like, if you can look up the origins of the Arab people and their customs before Islam, because a lot of a lot of the traditions of the Arabic people before, um, before Islam are very similar to the ones that Islam a lot of the traditions like for the pre-Islamic Arabian people were very similar to the traditions of the post-Islamic Arabian people. But so you have like a shared culture, of course, as Chad was talking about with the Arab people, and as an example. But there are more examples like the Turkic people that have their origins actually in northern China. They used to be, I believe, the Xiongnu people, and they had like these long migrations, over the centuries, going more and more west. Some of them ended up in Central Asia. Some of them ended up in like Caucasia and Eastern Europe, and some of them ended up in the Middle East, and that's where the modern Turkish nation came up with. That's where it was established. Off of ethnically Turkic people that if you trace back lineage, a few hundred or even a couple thousand years, could go back over to northern China. But the Turkic people, it's very widely spread throughout Europe and Asia. You have Turkic people in the nation of Turkmenistan. You have Turkic people near Afghanistan, then of course in Turkey and in near the Caucasian near the Caucasian nations like Azerbaijan. There are Turkic people. So is the Armenian people, I believe. And so you have a very big diaspora. And then also for the Han Chinese people, most of the Han Chinese ethnic group lives within China. And the Teutonic people, which is another name for the ethnic German people, which is very widely spread throughout Central Europe, a little bit of Southern Europe, and Scandinavia. And then Hispanic people, which people probably hear a lot more about. It's a much more common term. People probably hear a lot more, and that's for people with Spanish descent. So people that have a lineage that originates back in Spain. So we wanted to give examples of big ethnic groups, ethnic diasporas, but then also to kind of explain their histories because it actually is somewhat relevant to what we'll be talking about later on in this series. And you know, it's often confused with race,
Yeah.
ethnic groups, and it really shouldn't be. But I'm gonna let Chad explain that with a source from Merriam-Webster.
Oh, for sure. So with ethnicity, as we noted before, the common binding theme between an ethnicity is a shared language, a shared religion, and a shared culture. So these are ideas that a group of people will share. And so you could, if you were to bring them in a group, you could say that they all belong to that same group. You know, they believe in X God, the God of July, and they speak the language of Wyoming, and they have the culture of Yellowstone. And so you could say that they're of, that ethnic group. And so, as I said, as we'll come to explain, this is why, or this is what countries are sometimes wanted to be formed around, is these ethnic groups. But an interesting thing is that ethnicity is very often confused with race, and race is a different concept than ethnicity in that it takes some of the ideas of what a racial group it takes the ideas of what an ethnic group is, and then adds on some um, different characteristics that makes it different than ethnicities. So to start off, race, as defined by Merriam-Webster, is any one of the groups that humans are often divided into based on physical traits regarded as common among people of a shared ancestry. And so one of the big difference that you see between ethnicity and race is the inclusion of physical characteristics with how they divide people up. With race, they add in what's often as skin color. So instead of grouping people by their shared culture, language, religion, etc., they add in the idea of skin color. And then sometimes if you go deeper of like skull shape or nose shape, and that just gets into eugenics. That's adding in what the physical characteristics of some group would allegedly share. And so that makes it different than ethnicity. With ethnicity, it's very easy to say that these people share a language. With race, it's assuming that everyone of this ancestry or this background who has these physical characteristics share a same ancestry. And so
Right.
that's why you get some of the ideas of white people or black people being all from Africa or this, that, and the other. It's you're adding in these new ideas of physical characteristics and not just culture, because culture is what really binds a group of people together. Physical characteristics is something that's just on top of that. And that's a very new concept that was really added on in the late 1800s, 1900s. Um, that kind of came along with the um, emergence of evolution, Darwinism, and then eugenics, which would come from that, like a different interpretation of that as it came to humans. Um, but it's adding in what allegedly was a scientific take on grouping people.
Right, because the whole idea of ethnicity and race and trying to group people and trying to find differences, because of course, people look differently, but it's hard to find a group of people that look majority the same. It can be called a race, and it can be called any different from any other race that might look really similar to them, and noticing small differences or big differences or whatever. So the whole thing largely makes no sense and has been majority discredited as time has gone on. People have just given up trying to group up people, you know.
Yeah,
But with
straight up.
ethnicity, there is a fair definition, of what it is: shared language, shared culture, shared customs, um, and shared history for the most case. And when it gets dangerous is when people consider ethnicity to be race, which again is a much more cloudy, difficult to explain topic that makes no sense.
Yeah, I
And
see it
the
as like
way that they
rate.
do it
Okay.
is by, as Chad was just saying, with the physical characteristics such as skin color or nose shape or whatever. Um, and when you do that, it's based off of things that they cannot change. Like you can't change your history, with ethnicity, for example, but you can adopt a culture, you can adopt a language, you can be accepted into a new community. But with physical changes, you cannot change that. You cannot change your nose shape. You cannot change your skull shape or your skin color. So therefore it is immediately inherently exclusive. The idea of considering ethnicity to be race, or the whole idea of race in general, because the idea of grouping up people is basically as old as time. But the idea of making race something that cannot be changed is actually quite new. It used to just be new culture. It used to be like a different culture, language, customs, and maybe like shared history. But when you say physical characteristics that they cannot change, then it gets a lot more dangerous. And it's more like you can't convert these people into our group because in their mind, you know, they have a difference that they cannot change. Therefore, they must be exterminated because they cannot be assimilated at all.
Hmm. When you base your groupings around, yeah, inchangeable things, of course, no one's going to come to your side because they physically can't, according to your definition. I see the difference between race and ethnicity as kind of like you have a pyramid. Ethnicity starts from the bottom and goes its way up. Like it starts with the things that people share, where they live. You're living on the same block of the street. And then what they speak. They both speak English. And then what they believe. They both believe in Christianity or something like that. And then what they act, like how they act. What is their culture? They share that. And so you're building their way up. And then at the very end, like physical characteristics, who they physically are, isn't as important. What's important is those shared things that, as we said, can be changed and are already present in just how they are. With race, it kind of goes from the top down. It starts with the physical characteristics, who they are, this, that, and the other, and just assumes that, oh, they have that same background or that same language or that same culture all because they share a same skin color. And that's just completely ignorant of how humans are. Just because they share a similar physical characteristic. I mean, skin color is not absolute. I'm pretty sure you could easily say that two people don't have the exact same skin color at all. Like, I don't think
And
it's something outlandish to say that.
skin color can be changed by getting a long tan in the hot sun. Like
Yeah, and
that's
then you're gonna
it's
base your
stupid.
citizenship status off of that. It, I mean, compared to something as basic of where people live, what they speak, and what they believe in, race is just made up. It was just another way to categorize people in an inherently exclusive way, and not just exclusive, but just ignorant. Like just assume that they have the same skin color, that they all came from Africa, or they all believe in whatever God. Like that, it's not true. It's
Right.
made up. It's just still be using those. It can be just it somewhat seems silly in our day and age.
And the concept of race, as it is modern defined, and of making ethnicity a race, of like creating the concept of race upon things that cannot be changed, still exists. But the ethno-nationalists, like leaders, dictators, um, they like Hitler and Mussolini, very prominent ethno-nationalists. They came up in a time in which a lot of this was still very strongly believed, you know, but it was strongly believed in a very interesting way. They tried to get even more specific with their definitions of race. It would The idea of white people and black people and Asian people and like other different like huge sections of people around the world that people want to classify as being different people, that was too broad for people like Hitler and Mussolini, and especially Hitler. That they wanted to look at each nation and try to find evidence that they are their own separate race upon things that cannot be changed, like physical characteristics. That's why Hitler was so big on the eugenics game, you know? So um, you have these people, as being ethno nationalists that try to define the race centering around the nation and the nation being the race, which is, again, as we mentioned in our last series, is fascism. Um, that had been largely disestablished by the end of World War II. Very few people saw race as the nation and nation as the race anymore.
Yeah,
So by World War II, at the end of it, the idea of ethno-nationalism was believed to be done because no one believed in fascism. No one believed that race was the nation and nation was the race anymore. People thought that that idea had died with Hitler and died with Mussolini. But the question is, did it?
yeah. And as we'll come to see, we'll see that the idea did not die. It absolutely did not. It carried on in different leaders, especially in Europe, which is a place of many different ethnicities and many different divisions that have different characters wanting to take advantage of those and define their nations for themselves and exclude other people from that. And so ethno-nationalism absolutely did not end after the end of World War II. And some of the examples that we would come up to define them as today are one of the former leaders of the country of Yugoslavia, which we mentioned before, Slobodan Milosevic. He is someone we will come to define as an ethno-nationalist. Another one would be Vladimir Putin of Russia, and we'll have a very interesting episode about him and his beliefs on what's essentially an ethno-nationalist war against Ukraine.
See, it's really obviously you've heard of everything that's going on in Ukraine. It's a very bloody war that's going on. No disrespect to everything that's going on over there. Like the Ukrainians are fighting hard, the Russians are they're being evil, Putin specifically. But we had to look at one of those primary source documents of where Putin justified his beliefs, and we couldn't help but crack up. And we just we want to really prove to you that you can find the truth in every argument. Don't get confused by how one side may have a decent point, you know, um, and that one side also has an equally interesting point. With Putin, we really kind of laid down on the fact that you know he makes no sense. If there's
Yeah.
any bit of like confusion of whether or not he might have a point, by watching those episode or two that we might spend just absolutely bashing this guy, you'll understand that he was wrong and he is wrong still.
Oh yeah. Shout out to Series on Truth episode 1 where we said when the liar tells the truth, people don't know what to believe. Somehow people are falling for that. In the argument that Putin made, yeah, there were some very small, very tiny, specific little truths that may have been onto something in that, but the majority of that is just
Right.
it
Because
it is laughable.
it
And
is
we
incredibly laughable. Okay.
yeah,
But like we the point that we wanted to make, in that series with the whole kernels of truth, and just to kind of reestablish it for anyone that probably didn't see it, is that nobody, you'd say you have two people on different sides of an argument, and they're trying to come together and find a conclusion, that they can find the truth, that
mhm,
the truth might be somewhere in between. You might have heard that two people arguing with each other, the truth is somewhere in the middle, but the truth can never be exactly in the middle, because
it
then
leads.
one side is equally as true as the other, which is a Trumpian idea to begin with. The idea of alternative facts, that your truth is just as good as mine. That's not real. I think we should all know that's not real. So when people say the truth is somewhere in the middle, maybe, but it's not exactly 50-50. And then again, the truth can never be completely on one side or the other, or else the person that was completely wrong in this impossible scenario, you know, had no reason for thinking what they were thinking at all, and if that was the case, why would they believe it? And then let's say they had followers. If they had followers, why would they follow them if there
Yeah, you
wasn't
can't. You're not
something?
gonna latch onto something that was just completely pulled out of thin air. There has to be something to it, and there
Even if
always
it's
is. There's always that
99%
tiny.
lies.
Yeah, there's always that tiny, tiny, microscopic, quark-sized element of truth that's in there, even in the fake moon landing stuff. It's somehow there, and that's what's gonna get a couple people. But as we said, there, of course, there's elements of truth in every argument, but that does not mean that they're both valid, because as we'll come to show, this argument was completely
Laughable.
invalid. Like, well, we can't say 100%, but we'll give it that 99.98% invalid argument. And we had fun with that one, and I think you would too. Um,
Yeah,
and
we
yeah,
also look at Erdogan, the Turkish president. People probably don't know too much about him because, like he is the president of a nation that is a U.S. ally or and a NATO ally too,
yeah,
and so
Turkey goes under the radar pretty
yeah,
often.
they really do because they are allies of a lot of nations that in the West we see as like being like very just and correct. So you'd think that Turkey is like
It
like
goes
a
along with the team.
good country, but at the very least, their current leader, is a lot more maniacal than you might think. And as we mentioned, I think before, the deal of Finland and Sweden joining NATO, the only person that was significantly opposing it, from what we heard in the media, was Erdogan. And that was because Finland and Sweden were holding Kurdish politicians, an ethnic group in Turkey. We'll talk about it more, and civilians too. That he wanted to extradite to Turkey to be tried and who knows, maybe even killed and heavily imprisoned and whatever, just for being who they are and trying to advocate for some self autonomy in Turkey. So he really goes under the radar, and we're going to spend a bit of time, sometime over the next few episodes, explaining why he is an ethno-nationalist himself and really should be recognized as one, regardless of the strategic consequences.
Yeah. And another one that we're going to be looking at is Xi Jinping of the People's Republic of China. And this is one that you probably have heard of in his ethno-nationalist, sentiments of how he's taken the country. The biggest example that obviously gets brought up a lot is the treatment of the Uyghurs, which is an ethnic group in southwestern China, which is ethnically, were they Turkish or
Yeah, they're
yeah,
ethnically Turkic people. Yeah.
ethnically Turkic people, Muslim believing, which of course goes against the majority Han Chinese nation of China. And so we'll look at the treatment of the Uyghur people by the Chinese government and show how their policies and their rhetoric as well has furthered an ethno-nationalist take for their nation, and how they feel that this kind of diversity can set them back and apparently hold them from their greatness if these people exist. And yeah, with that, we also have some other examples that we'll be looking up that
Honorable
aren't
mention.
exactly queer. Some of those are Modi of India. He's the leader of India. He came in 2014. And some of his policies towards Muslims and in the nation who, is divided with Pakistan in the Kashmir region, have some national, at the very least, nationalist sentiments, if not ethno-nationalists themselves. Um, and another example we have is Viktor Orban of the country of Hungary. With him, it's another case of nationalism, if not ethno-nationalism, carried in with a lot of, Islamophobia,
Right.
suspicion of immigrants coming into the country, stamping down on Muslim belief. Um,
Yeah. And there's also like Andre Duda. He is the
of Poland.
current, yeah, the current president, prime minister, whatever they call it over there, of Poland, since 2015. Um, he has been very Islamophobic in his immigration policies. Like some people might have heard about the contradiction, of Poland's foreign policy as it relates to immigration. Since the Ukraine war, like Duda was willing to accept a lot of Ukrainians, millions of Ukrainians, and people were really gracious and thankful for it. Like Poland has so many Ukrainian immigrants that they probably have too much. They've been gracious. But with Middle Eastern people, like people from Syria, um, that are fleeing war-torn areas, gone. They way shunned.
Yeah, not
So
too friendly with those people.
yeah,
Yeah. And so we'll look at those contradictions, those examples of how they may be nationalists, they may be ethno-nationalists, they may be Islamic phobic. We'll dive deeper into it because those ones are a little more muddy and a little more confusing than obvious examples like Hitler, Mussolini, and Putin. And so, yeah, we're just about at our time. And with our next episode, we'll dive deeper again into the idea of ethno nationalism and differentiating the ideas of civic nationalism, which usually is based around a state, and cultural nationalism, which follows a lot closer to what we call ethnic nationalism, in emphasizing a state or a culture above everyone else. And so, yeah, with that, it's about our time. Like, subscribe, comment, bless the YouTube algorithm, send it to someone who might be interested or someone who's not interested, someone who's heard of ethnic nationalism or have not. Just send it around. I'm sure they'll be interested.
right. And for those of you guys that are like very young adults, that I'm sure that the first of our followers went to our high school, and would probably really use really would really have benefited or would still benefit from a little research on the idea of race throughout history, and how it has been defined, and how people bastardize it with ethnicity and their differences and their similarities. And we'd hope that this channel really, for a lot of different topics, but this series and even just this particular episode to teach you about very quickly, just speed up the playback speed. I know we speak really slowly, um, to just understand those concepts, because we think that they'd be beneficial to you as well. But anyway, without a further ado, we are the Marshals of Truth.
We will see you in the next episode.